Welcome to the Sleepy Christian, where we end the day not with fear or noise, but with the quiet comfort of God's Word. Tonight, we travel back to a sacred moment in the stillness of the night, when a young boy named Samuel lay sleeping, and the voice of God called out to him. As you listen, let this be more than just a bedtime story. Let it be a reminder that even in your quietest, loneliest hours, God is near. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. It brings us peace to see believers resting in God's presence all around the world. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen. The temple was quiet, the kind of stillness that only night can bring. Outside, the world slept beneath a soft blanket of stars. The winds no longer rustled the trees, and the fires in the homes of Israel had burned down to glowing embers. But within the temple, a small flame still danced. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. It was a sacred flame, not just a light for seeing, but a symbol of something deeper, God's presence among His people. According to the command given to Moses, this lamp was to burn continually, and the priests made sure it was kept alive through the night. Its glow was gentle, flickering across the walls of the holy place, casting long, dancing shadows that whispered stories of Israel's past. In this quiet place, a young boy lay asleep near the Ark of the Covenant. His name was Samuel. He was not just any boy. Samuel had been given to the Lord by his mother, Hannah, a woman who had wept and prayed for a child, promising that if God blessed her, she would return the child to serve in his house all the days of his life. God had heard her prayer, and true to her word, Hannah brought her son, still very young, and left him at the temple in Shiloh under the care of Eli the priest. Now, Samuel lived in this holy place. He slept not far from the ark, which rested behind a veil, a sacred box that held the 10 Commandments and represented the very throne of God on earth. The air was thick with a sense of the divine, even in the silence. Though he was just a child, Samuel had begun to serve. Each day he would sweep the temple courts, prepare oil for the lamps, help Eli with simple tasks. He was quiet, obedient, and pure of heart. His days were filled with routine, his nights filled with dreams. And on this particular night, the old priest Eli lay nearby. His eyesight was failing. Age had dimmed the world around him. His movements were slow, and his voice had grown soft with time. Yet still, he remained in the temple, faithful to his duty, resting as the final years of his life passed like the last drops of oil in the sacred lamp. The lamp had not yet gone out. It's a small detail in the story, but it means so much. In the Bible, when the writer mentions that the lamp of God had not yet gone out, it signals both a literal moment in the night and a spiritual truth. Darkness may have crept over the land. The times may have been hard. Israel was in moral decline and visions from God were rare, but that lamp still burned. That tiny flicker still shone, reminding anyone watching that God was not absent. His light still endured, and so, in that sacred hush, while shadows clung to the corners of the temple, and while Eli slept and Samuel breathed slowly in his rest, something was about to happen. The God of the universe, the same God who parted seas, who thundered on Mount Sinai, who spoke through burning bushes, was about to speak again. Not to a warrior, not to a prophet, not to a king, but to a child. While the lamp still burned, while the world was quiet, while everyone thought God had gone silent, God whispered in the dark, and the boy, though he didn't know it yet, was about to wake up to the voice of heaven. Samuel's story did not begin with his own voice, but with the voice of a woman crying out to God in quiet desperation. Long before the temple, before the dreams, before the call in the night, there was Hannah, a woman whose heart ached with sorrow. She had no children, and in a culture where motherhood was seen as a divine blessing, she bore the shame of barrenness like a heavy cloak. Year after year, Hannah traveled with her husband Elkanah to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, where they would offer sacrifices and prayers. But each time, the burden on her soul grew heavier. One year, in silent anguish, she knelt near the temple and wept bitterly. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was a prayer spoken straight from the heart. "Lord," she pleaded, "if you would only look upon your servant's misery and remember me. If you give me a son, I will give him back to you all the days of his life." The priest Eli had seen her there, moving her lips with no voice, and at first he thought she was drunk. But when Hannah explained her pain and her prayer, he gently blessed her, saying, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request." And God did. In time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." She loved him with the full strength of a mother's heart, but she had made a vow, and she would keep it. Once the child was weaned, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, she took him to the temple at Shiloh and left him there, not because she didn't love him, but because she did. Her heart broke and rejoiced at the same time. She was offering her greatest treasure to God. So this is how Samuel came to live in the house of the Lord, a child, still small enough to cling to his mother's robes, still learning how to speak and think and pray, and yet entrusted with a sacred life in the temple, a place of rituals, of law, of holy objects, of quiet mystery. He grew up under the care of Eli, the high priest. Eli was old and tired, but he took on the responsibility of raising this child in the way of the Lord. Samuel would have learned how to pour oil into the golden lampstand, how to wash the temple tools, how to listen carefully and obey without question. He was taught the scriptures, shown how to bow before the ark, and likely heard the same stories over and over again. The stories of Abraham, of Moses, of God's faithfulness to his people. But Samuel wasn't just being trained for service. He was being formed, shaped in silence, grown in sacred rhythms. Day after day, his life was wrapped in the steady rituals of temple life. The mornings began with offerings and prayers. The afternoons may have included lessons, tasks, the sweep of the broom across the stone floors, or the sound of footsteps echoing through the hollow courts. The evenings were dimly lit by the golden glow of the lampstand as the scent of incense floated gently through the air. The sound of Eli's slow breathing and soft prayers would accompany the dark. In the quiet of that place, Samuel's heart was being prepared. He likely didn't understand it. He probably wondered why his mother left him, or why his life was so different from the children he may have glimpsed from the temple gate. But God was watching and waiting and forming in Samuel a heart that would be able to hear. What makes Samuel's childhood so sacred is not that it was extraordinary on the outside. It was, in many ways, simple, repetitive, humble. But in that simplicity, God was sowing seeds for something eternal. He did not grow up in a palace. He did not receive worldly training or hold great titles. But Samuel lived where the presence of God rested. He slept near the ark. He woke to the sound of prayer. He breathed the holy silence of the sanctuary. And sometimes that's all God needs, a heart that is close enough to hear when he whispers. In a time when many hearts had grown cold, when the word of the Lord was rare, and when the people of Israel had forgotten how to listen, a child, offered in faith, raised in quiet and growing in purity, was drawing near to the moment for which he had been born. Samuel may not have known it, but the silence was not empty. It was pregnant with purpose. And every humble task he did in the temple was a step toward the divine call that would one day wake him from his sleep. Night had fully embraced the land, wrapping Shiloh in shadows and stillness. The stars outside burned quietly in the sky like watchful eyes, and a gentle wind sighed through the trees, rustling the leaves in soft rhythms. Inside the temple, all was silent. The stone walls held the cool of the night, and the air carried the faint scent of oil and incense, remnants of the day's offerings. The lamp of God still flickered beside the Ark of the Covenant, casting a warm, golden light that danced and wavered across the ancient wood and gold. Samuel lay in his usual place, his small body curled into the bedding of simple linen. He was not dreaming. His breath was slow, steady, the rhythm of a child deep in peaceful sleep. Eli, not far away, was also lying down, his old frame resting, his eyes dim with age, his mind likely drifting in and out of shallow dreams. Then it came, the voice. A sound not heard in the temple for a long time, a voice that had once thundered from Mount Sinai, that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, that had guided prophets, kings, and shepherds. It had been silent for many years, but now it returned. Samuel. The boy stirred. His eyes blinked open in the dark. There was no fear, just confusion. His young mind processed the name he had heard, clear, strong, unmistakable. He sat up, heart steady but curious. Who had called him? The voice had sounded real, so real that he instinctively got to his feet. He padded softly across the stone floor, the chill biting gently at his bare feet. The temple felt larger in the quiet, every sound amplified. As he reached Eli, who lay resting in his chamber nearby, Samuel spoke gently. "Here I am. You called me." Eli stirred, confused by the interruption. His voice was tired but kind. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel nodded, obedient and without complaint, and returned to his bed. He lay back down, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. The light of the lamp still flickered. The silence returned, but only for a moment. Then again the voice came, the same voice, calm, firm, personal. "Samuel." Again, he rose. The voice had not been in his mind. It had come from somewhere, someone. The call had been too real to ignore. Once more, he went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Eli looked at him more closely this time, his brows furrowed in thought, but he still shook his head slowly. "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." A second time, Samuel obeyed. He lay back down in the quiet sanctuary. The walls, the lamp, the sacred ark, all surrounded him again, and again the silence pressed in. For most people, silence is empty, but in the house of God, silence is full. It is not the absence of sound, but the waiting of heaven. It is a space where the eternal prepares to meet the temporal. And then, for the third time, the voice came. "Samuel." The boy's heart must have skipped. 3 times now. Not a dream, not his imagination, but something real, something steady. He went again to Eli, the only person he could think of who might be calling his name in the night. Once more he said, "Here I am. You called me." Eli sat up more fully now. Something began to dawn in his aging mind. This was not a game, nor a misunderstanding. It was something deeper. Eli had lived many years, had seen miracles, had heard the voice of the Lord in his youth. And though it had been a long time since God had spoken directly to anyone in Israel, Eli realized what was happening. He looked at the boy with new eyes. Then he said, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" It was a turning point. Until now, Samuel had served God, but he had not yet heard him. Until now, he had known about the Lord through others, through his mother, through Eli, through stories and teachings. But now, something was changing. The invisible God was stepping close. The quiet of the temple was about to break open with divine purpose. Samuel returned to his bed once more. But this time, his heart was ready. His ears were open. He lay there, still and watchful, no longer confused but expectant. The lamp of God still burned, and the voice of heaven was about to speak again. Samuel lay in the quiet once more, wrapped in a sense of expectancy he didn't fully understand. The soft glow of the temple lamp still flickered in the shadows, a gentle golden flame that marked the presence of something sacred. The silence felt heavier now, not in a way that frightened him, but in a way that made him aware. Something was different. The air felt thicker, time felt slower, as if the night itself was waiting for what came next. Only moments ago, he had risen a third time and gone to Eli, confused but obedient. Each time he had heard his name spoken in the dark, and each time he had assumed it was the old priest calling for help, perhaps needing water or comfort in the night. But now, Eli had given him an instruction that stirred something in the boy's heart. A strange mix of anticipation and wonder. "If he calls again," Eli had said, "say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Samuel had repeated those words in his mind as he walked back to his bedding. He whispered them to himself as he lay down again. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." It was a strange phrase to say aloud. He had never spoken directly to God. That was something only prophets did, grown men, holy men. But now he was being told that God might actually be speaking to him. Stillness returned, the faint creak of old wood in the temple, the occasional sigh of wind outside, the quiet breathing of Eli somewhere nearby. All of it faded into the background. Then came the voice, but this time it was different. "Samuel, Samuel." 2 times his name was called, not once. There was something personal in it now. Intimate, tender, as though the voice didn't just know his name, but knew him. And this time, he didn't rise from his bed. He didn't run to Eli. He stayed right where he was, in the warmth of the shadows, and with his heart pounding and his hands lightly trembling, he spoke the words Eli had told him. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." It was the moment everything changed. Up until this point, Samuel had been a helper in the temple, a student, a child of obedience, a boy born of a vow. But now, with that one simple sentence, he crossed a line from hearing about God to hearing from God, from serving out of duty to listening out of relationship. And God spoke, not with thunder, not with fire or a blinding vision, but in the quiet of the night, in the gentle darkness, in a whisper, clear and holy. It's important to pause here and reflect on what just happened. 3 times Samuel had heard the voice of God and mistook it for the voice of a man. Why? Because it sounded familiar, it sounded human, and that in itself is a beautiful truth. When God speaks to us, it is often not in strange or foreign ways, but in a tone we can recognize, one that gently echoes the voices of love and care in our lives. That's why Samuel ran to Eli. The voice was gentle, parental, known. He had confused the divine for the ordinary. And that is something many of us do. We expect God to speak in thunderclaps and burning bushes, but often he speaks through ordinary moments, familiar voices, quiet stirrings of the heart. Samuel didn't recognize the voice of God because he had never heard it before. It wasn't until Eli helped him see what was happening that he became ready to truly listen. Even Eli, with all his flaws and spiritual fatigue, had enough wisdom left to recognize the pattern. He saw in Samuel what he himself had once experienced, a moment of divine calling, a whisper in the dark. And though Eli's time was fading, he passed on this wisdom. Be still, be open, and when the Lord calls again, respond. That moment of mistaken identity, thinking it was Eli instead of God, was not a mistake in the eyes of heaven. It was part of the process, a gentle drawing in. God was patient. He called again and again. He did not give up when Samuel failed to understand. He waited for Samuel to be ready. He guided the child into recognition, slowly, tenderly. And when Samuel finally responded, heaven opened. No lightning, no miracles, just the voice of God, reaching into the soul of a child and inviting him into a conversation that would shape the destiny of a nation. God had not chosen a scholar, a soldier, or a king. He had chosen a boy who mistook the voice of God for something ordinary. And in that mistake, he revealed a truth we all need to hear. God often speaks to us in ways we don't expect, and he keeps calling until we learn to listen. The temple remained bathed in shadows, the silence deeper now, not empty, but full of meaning, full of waiting, full of the presence of something beyond human understanding. Outside, the night pressed on, and the world around Shiloh slept, unaware that history was quietly turning inside the sanctuary. The flame of the lamp still burned beside the Ark of the Covenant, steady and unwavering, like God himself, who watches while all others slumber. Samuel lay still, his young face tilted slightly upward, his hands resting over his heart. The voice had called him again, twice this time. There had been no mistaking it now, and with childlike faith and trembling reverence, he had spoken the words Eli had given him. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And the Lord did speak. The voice of God broke through the veil between heaven and earth, not with thunder or spectacle, but in quiet authority. The voice that had formed galaxies, parted seas, and breathed life into dust, now addressed a child lying on the temple floor. The words spoken to Samuel that night were weighty, words of judgment, of coming change, of sorrow and truth. And yet behind the weight there was something else, trust. God was trusting this child with a message that would shake the very foundations of Israel's priesthood. Not because Samuel was powerful, not because he was eloquent, but because his heart was pure, because he was willing to listen. This was the first time the boy truly heard the voice of the Lord, and it came not with comfort, but with gravity. The message was about Eli, his mentor, his guardian, the priest who had raised him since he was a toddler. God told Samuel that judgment was coming upon Eli's house because Eli had allowed his sons to commit great sins without stopping them. His sons, who were also priests, had treated the offerings of the Lord with contempt and had corrupted their sacred duties. Eli knew it, but he had not taken action. His heart had grown too passive, and now God's patience had reached its end. For a boy like Samuel, this must have been overwhelming. Imagine hearing such a word, heavy, final, filled with sorrow, and knowing that it concerned the very man who had cared for you like a father. The voice of God was not giving Samuel a simple task. It was asking him to bear a truth that no child should have to carry. Yet God knew what he was doing. He chose Samuel because Samuel's heart was still untouched by pride, unclouded by ambition. He had no agenda, no personal gain to pursue. His only instinct was obedience. And God always begins his greatest works through hearts like that, humble, listening, unassuming. As the voice faded and the silence returned, Samuel lay awake. Sleep would not come easily now. His eyes were open, staring into the shadows, not out of fear, but out of awe. He had heard the voice of the living God, not through dreams, not through second-hand stories, but directly, personally, and it had changed him. He did not run to Eli this time. He did not speak a word. He simply lay there, silent and still, holding the message inside him. Morning would come soon, and with it, the weight of obedience. The truth is, obedience is not always easy. Sometimes it demands everything from us, our comfort, our certainty, even our relationships. Samuel now held knowledge that would wound Eli's heart. The very man who had taught him how to sweep the temple courts, how to tend the holy flame, how to listen for God. Samuel was now being asked to deliver a divine judgment against him. This is what it means to be called. It is not about power or glory. It is not about applause or fame. It is about the quiet courage to carry truth, even when it hurts. To speak, even when your voice shakes. To remain faithful, even when the task is too great for your own strength. God's choice of Samuel tells us something profound. That divine revelation doesn't always begin in strength. It begins in surrender. Samuel had no idea what the rest of his life would hold. But in that one moment, lying awake in the dark, he said yes to the voice that called him. And that yes changed everything. The Lord, who had once walked with Adam in the cool of the garden, who had spoken to Abraham under the stars, and who had thundered from Sinai, had now spoken to a boy in the stillness of night. And the boy had answered, he had listened, and he had received a message that would not only define his own life, but signal the end of an old era and the beginning of something new. God was speaking again, and he had chosen a child to carry his voice. Morning began to stir slowly over Shiloh. The shadows of the temple thinned as the first soft rays of sunlight reached over the horizon and slipped through the cracks and edges of the holy place. The sacred lamp, which had burned through the night, was now growing dim, soon to be extinguished by the natural light of day. The world outside began to awaken with birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves, but inside the temple, something far more significant had already taken place. Samuel remained still, his eyes open, his heart heavy. He had not slept since the voice of the Lord had spoken to him. The words echoed again and again in his mind, clear, unwavering, undeniable. It was not a dream, not a thought, not something imagined. God had spoken, and what he had said carried the weight of judgment, sorrow, and unchangeable truth. The child lay there in silence, not because he was disobedient or uncertain, but because he was wrestling with the burden of what he had received. This was not a small task. God had given him a message not for strangers, but for someone he loved. Eli, the priest, the man who had taught him the ways of the Lord, who had cared for him like a father, who had helped him understand the voice he had just heard. It was Eli who had said, "If he calls again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And now that same voice had declared the end of Eli's priesthood, the punishment of his house, and the consequences of years of silence and inaction. How does a boy deliver such a message to the one who raised him? As the light grew, Samuel remained where he was, not out of fear alone, but out of deep reverence. He was still processing the moment, still holding the words in his heart like something fragile and burning. He must have wondered, why me? Why now? What will happen when I tell him? Will he be angry? Will he be hurt? And yet, even with those questions, Samuel did not run away. He did not pretend the voice had never spoken. He waited. And then Eli called to him. It was morning. Perhaps Eli had noticed the boy's quietness, or perhaps he sensed something had happened. He called out, "Samuel, my son." Samuel responded just as he always had. "Here I am." There was a pause. Then Eli asked the question Samuel had feared. "What was it he said to you? Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." It was not a threat, but a plea. Eli knew. He knew that God had spoken. He had seen the signs. He had recognized the voice calling in the night. And now he wanted the truth, however painful it might be. Samuel sat up. Perhaps his voice trembled. Perhaps tears welled in his eyes. But he spoke. The scriptures say he told Eli everything. He held nothing back. Every word of the prophecy, every part of the judgment. He repeated it all. The fall of Eli's house, the sin of his sons, the divine verdict that could no longer be postponed. For a moment, silence must have filled the space between them. A silence heavier than the one in the night. And then Eli spoke, not with anger, not with denial, but with quiet acceptance. "He is the Lord," Eli said. "Let him do what is good in his eyes." It was a moment of incredible grace. Though the message was one of judgment, Eli received it with humility. He did not lash out at the boy. He did not defend himself or protest. He recognized the truth in the words, and perhaps, deep in his heart, he had known it was coming. His time was ending, and God had chosen a new voice to rise in Israel. And that voice was Samuel's. This moment was the beginning of Samuel's transformation, not just from child to prophet, but from servant to leader. He had heard the voice of God. He had spoken truth, even when it hurt. He had shown courage not by strength, but by obedience. The courage to listen when others could not. The courage to carry truth when others had ignored it. The courage to speak what was difficult and to do so with humility. What happened that morning was not just a passing event, it was a holy initiation. God had tested Samuel's heart and the boy had not turned away. This is the kind of courage God honors, not the kind that charges into battle, but the kind that listens in the stillness. The kind that holds sacred things with trembling hands. The kind that says, "Yes, Lord," even when the message is hard, even when it costs us comfort, safety, or affection. Samuel had now walked the first steps of a path that would define the rest of his life. He had faced his first great test, and passed it not by being perfect, but by being faithful. And the Lord was watching. The flame of the lamp may have been fading with the rising sun, but in Samuel's heart a new flame had been lit, one that would never go out. The sun had risen fully over Shiloh, casting golden light across the hills and warming the stone walls of the temple. Life had resumed its slow rhythm in the sanctuary. The quiet shuffling of the elderly priest Eli, the distant sounds of animals being prepared for sacrifice, the rustle of robes, and the echo of voices offering morning prayers. But within Samuel, something had forever changed. He had heard the voice of the Lord, and not just heard. It had spoken to him personally, entrusted him with a divine message, and watched as he obeyed, even when the truth weighed heavily on his heart. That moment had marked the beginning of a transformation. Samuel was no longer just the quiet boy who swept the temple courts and trimmed the lamps. He was now a vessel for God's word, a bearer of divine truth, and heaven had taken notice. But the message Samuel had received was not one of blessing or comfort. It was a message of judgment, a prophecy of coming justice, spoken against Eli, the man who had raised him. It was a word about accountability, consequences, and the end of a sacred line of priests who had failed to protect the holiness of their office. This was no easy word to carry. It was not a reward, but a burden. And yet Samuel carried it with grace. The message had been spoken in secret, in the dark hours before dawn, but its truth was not meant to stay hidden. Though Samuel had been afraid at first, he had told Eli everything. Not because he wanted to hurt him, and not because he wanted power, but because God had spoken. And when God speaks, the only faithful response is to speak in return, with honesty, humility, and fear of the Lord. This was the beginning of Samuel's ministry. What's remarkable is how God chose to begin it, not with grand visions or public miracles, but with a hard truth shared in a private moment. No crowds were watching, no trumpets were sounding. It was quiet, it was painful, and it was sacred. That is often how God works. He begins in the hidden places, in silence, in stillness, in the dark corners of our lives. He chooses not the proud or the powerful, but the humble and willing. He does not test us with glory, but with truth. And when he finds someone who is willing to listen and obey, he begins to move through them in ways the world cannot see until much later. Samuel had passed that first test. And so the Lord began to establish him. Word began to spread slowly at first, whispers among the priests, murmurs among the people. They began to notice something about this boy who had always been so quiet. There was a weight to him now, a depth behind his eyes, a calmness in his spirit. His presence carried a kind of reverence, as if he had stood in a place no one else had seen. And indeed, he had. He had stood in the presence of God. The scriptures say that the Lord was with Samuel as he grew, and that he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. That phrase alone is powerful. None of Samuel's words were wasted, ignored, or forgotten. Why? Because they were not just his words. They were born from the voice that had spoken to him in the night. They carried heaven's authority. This was not the kind of authority that shouts or demands. It was the quiet, steady authority of truth, of someone who had heard the voice of God and learned to speak only when that voice stirred within him. As Samuel continued to grow, Israel began to see the hand of God resting on him. From Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, the people came to recognize that the Lord had raised up a new prophet, a prophet who did not seek attention, who did not seek control, but who simply listened and obeyed. And the word of the Lord, which had once been rare in those days, began to flow again, not through rituals, not through empty tradition, but through a child who had become a servant, and a servant who had become a messenger. This is the power of hearing God and having the courage to respond. It is not glamorous. It often begins with a heavy word. But when God finds someone who will carry his truth faithfully, he entrusts them with more, and through them, he awakens nations. Samuel's message to Eli had been heavy, but it had also been holy. It had set in motion a divine transition, a changing of seasons, the end of what had been tolerated for too long, and the beginning of something new, something pure, honest, and aligned with God's heart. In this way, Samuel's first message reflected something deeper, the character of God himself. God is not indifferent. He does not overlook corruption. He does not stay silent forever. But he is patient. He gives warning. He sends truth, not to destroy, but to restore. And he often sends it through the humble, through a child in the temple, through a voice that simply says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And so, the boy who had once mistaken the voice of God for the call of a man now carried that divine voice within him. He had received a heavy message, and he had delivered it with a faithful heart. That is where greatness begins, not in the ease of the message, but in the courage to speak it. The first rays of sunlight broke fully over the hills of Shiloh, spilling golden light into the temple and illuminating the ancient stones with a warmth that seemed to push away the weight of the night. Yet within Samuel, the heaviness lingered, not from fear, but from the deep responsibility of having been chosen to carry the voice of the Lord. The boy had crossed a spiritual threshold. He was no longer merely a servant of the temple, a helper in the shadows. He was now a bearer of divine truth. And though he still wore the clothes of a child, his soul was being shaped into that of a prophet. But the morning after God's voice had come did not begin with celebration. It began with hesitation. Samuel, who had always been quick to obey, now moved slowly, not because of rebellion, but because of reverence. He had heard a message that would shake the heart of the one who had raised him. His first prophetic word had not been for a stranger or an enemy. It had been for Eli, the old priest who had taught him to serve, to pray, to listen. The words Samuel had received were not easy. God was bringing judgment upon Eli's house. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had treated the sacrifices of the Lord with contempt, abusing their sacred roles for personal gain. They had corrupted the priesthood with greed, arrogance, and immorality. And though Eli had known, he had failed to stop them. He had spoken to them, yes, but his rebukes were too soft, too late. The Lord had waited. He had sent warnings. He had shown patience. But now, the time for silence had ended. The message burned in Samuel's heart, and as the temple stirred awake, he likely found himself caught in an agonizing tension between love for Eli and loyalty to God, between the comfort of silence and the calling to speak. It is not easy to deliver truth when it will pierce the heart of someone you care for, and yet, that is exactly what prophets are often called to do. Eli, for all his faults, was not a fool. He sensed something had changed. He had been the one to guide Samuel the night before, to recognize that the voice calling the boy was not his own, but the voice of the Lord. And now, in the light of morning, he saw the boy's quietness, his restraint, and he understood. He called to Samuel gently, "My son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." Then came the difficult moment. Eli asked him plainly, "What did the Lord say to you? Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." Those words, though firm, were not spoken in anger. They were the words of a man who had walked with God and now stood at the edge of his judgment. Eli knew what was coming. He did not try to run from it. In this moment, he was not just a priest speaking to a servant. He was a man of God, humbling himself before the truth, even when it came through the mouth of a child. Samuel, trembling perhaps, obeyed. He told him everything, the entire vision, the final judgment, the promise that the iniquity of Eli's house would not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. There was no way to soften it, no way to make it easier. Samuel spoke the truth, not because he wanted to, but because he was faithful. That is the calling of a prophet, not to speak what is pleasant, but to speak what is true. And Eli, tired, aging, nearly blind, received the word with grace. "He is the Lord," he said. "Let him do what is good in his eyes." That sentence, simple and quiet, held an entire lifetime of faith. Eli had failed in some ways, yes, but in this moment, he responded not with denial or anger, but with surrender. He accepted the word of the Lord, even though it came through the lips of a boy. This exchange between Samuel and Eli is one of the most sacred in all of Scripture. It is a moment of generational transfer, one era ending, another beginning. The old priest, whose time was passing, accepted the verdict from the new prophet, whose time was just beginning. There was no fight, no bitterness, just reverence for the voice of God. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's story. From that day forward, Samuel was no longer just a helper in the temple. He was known as the one whom God had chosen. As he grew, the Lord continued to speak to him, and the people of Israel began to recognize his calling. The scripture says that all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, came to know that Samuel was a prophet of the Lord. But that morning, before the honor, before the recognition, there was only a boy and a message, a child and a priest, a hard truth and a humble heart. And something beautiful happened in that exchange. Samuel learned that being chosen by God is not about glory, but about trust. He learned that obedience sometimes means delivering messages that break hearts. And he saw, through Eli's response, that even in judgment, there can be peace if there is surrender. It's easy to think that prophecy is about fire from heaven and great signs, but it begins here, in the quiet courage to speak what is difficult and the humility to receive what is painful. That morning in Shiloh, there were no loud declarations, no grand announcements, just honesty, just truth, and the beginning of a life lived in full service to the voice that speaks in the dark and shines in the morning. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, something remarkable began to unfold in Israel. What had once been a silent land, a nation where the word of the Lord was rare and visions were infrequent, began to stir again. The silence that had once hung over the tabernacle like a shroud was now lifting, replaced by something sacred and living. The presence of God was returning, and it was returning through the life of a boy. Samuel continued to grow, not only in age, but in wisdom, character, and spiritual authority. He was no longer just the child left by his mother in the temple courts. He was no longer just the quiet voice in the shadow of Eli. Samuel was now becoming the voice of the Lord to an entire nation. And the most extraordinary thing of all, God remained with him. Scripture tells us that the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. These are not small words. They mean that every time Samuel spoke in the name of the Lord, it was as though heaven itself confirmed his voice. Nothing he said was wasted. Nothing was ignored. Every word landed with weight and purpose, because Samuel only spoke what God had given him to say. This wasn't something he learned overnight. It was forged through reverence, through obedience, and through countless quiet hours in the temple, learning to listen before he dared to speak. The presence of God remained with Samuel because Samuel remained close to the presence of God. He didn't chase the attention of men. He didn't try to build his own influence. He didn't speak for his own sake. He had learned from his very first encounter with the voice of God that this calling was not about him. It was about something far greater. It was about being a vessel, someone whose life was so open, so surrendered, that the voice of God could pass through it clearly without distortion. And the people noticed. They began to recognize that this boy, now growing into a young man, was not like the others. He was not like Eli's sons, who had used their positions for personal gain. He was not like the leaders of other nations who ruled by force or charm. Samuel carried something different, a quiet authority, a gravity that came not from himself but from the one who walked beside him. Word spread across the land, from the northernmost tribes in Dan to the southern edges of Beersheba. All of Israel came to understand a prophet had arisen, a true prophet, one who did not manipulate the word of God for favor, one who did not seek to entertain or persuade, one who simply listened and then spoke. The transformation was not just in Samuel, it began to ripple through the nation itself. The people had grown used to silence from heaven. For years they had wondered if God still spoke at all. The priests had become corrupt, the rituals had become hollow, and in that spiritual drought, the people had lost their hunger. They had forgotten what it meant to be led by the voice of God. But now, the silence was breaking, and every word that passed through Samuel's lips reminded them that God was still present, that he still cared, that he still called his people back to himself. Imagine what it must have been like to see Samuel speak. There would have been no theatrics, no grand performances, just the still presence of a young man who had heard God in the dark and who now walked in the light with unwavering faith. Perhaps people traveled miles to hear him. Perhaps mothers whispered to their children, "That is Samuel, the boy who sleeps beside the ark, the one God speaks to." Perhaps elders in distant towns sat in silence when his words arrived, knowing that what they heard was not the voice of a man, but the echo of heaven. Samuel did not need to prove himself. God proved him, again and again. Every time he opened his mouth, the truth struck hearts. Conviction followed. And in time, hope began to awaken in the people of Israel. Hope that maybe God was not finished with them. Hope that maybe the covenant still stood. Hope that though the darkness had been long, the dawn was finally breaking. And in the center of it all stood Samuel. Not because he had sought greatness, but because he had been willing to say one thing in the middle of the night. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Those words had opened a door between heaven and earth. And through that door, the presence of God had returned to dwell, not in fire and thunder, but in the voice of a faithful heart. And so Samuel grew, not into a king, not into a warrior, but into something rarer still, a prophet who walked in the presence of God, a man whose very life reminded Israel of what they had forgotten, that God speaks, that God stays, and that God remains with those who are willing to listen. Sometimes God doesn't speak when the sun is shining or when life feels certain. Sometimes he doesn't speak when we are surrounded by people or when everything is going according to plan. No, often God speaks in the dark. He calls when the world is asleep, when the heart is still, when all distractions have faded and we are left alone with ourselves. This is when his voice comes, not in thunder, but in a whisper, not in the roar of the crowd, but in the silence of the soul. And when he calls by name. Samuel, Samuel. The voice of God is personal. It doesn't speak to us as a crowd, but as individuals, by name, into the specific depths of who we are. It knows what we carry. It knows what we hide. It knows what we long for and what we fear. God doesn't just call the strong, he calls the listening, and sometimes those who are called feel the least prepared. Samuel was just a boy, lying in the dark. He didn't expect to be called. He didn't know what it meant to be chosen, but he had something more powerful than experience. He had availability. He had a heart that was ready to listen, and that is all God needed. Many of us imagine that God only speaks to prophets, saints, or mighty leaders, but Samuel's story shatters that idea. God spoke to a child whose life had been offered to him in faith, a child who had learned to serve in small things, a child who, when called, didn't yet recognize the voice, but when he did, responded with the words that define every true follower. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That simple sentence is the doorway to everything sacred. It's the posture of the soul that welcomes transformation. It's not a demand for answers. It's not a request for signs or wonders. It's an act of surrender. It says, "I may not understand, but I am here." It says, "Even in the darkness, I believe you are near." And it says, "Whatever you speak, I will receive." When God called Samuel, he wasn't just inviting him to hear a message, he was inviting him into a life of walking with God, of speaking his words, of being the kind of person through whom heaven touches earth. That same invitation comes to us. It doesn't always arrive in moments of peace. Sometimes it comes when we are troubled, sometimes in grief, sometimes when we are unsure of who we are or when we feel forgotten. but the call still comes, and the voice still speaks. Maybe it's not audible. Maybe it comes as a stirring in the heart, a sense that there's more to life than what we see, a whisper in the spirit that says, "Come closer," a question in the silence, "Are you listening?" And like Samuel, we often don't recognize it at first. We run to other voices. We assume it's something familiar. We don't expect it to be God because we imagine God only speaks to holy people. And we forget that holiness often begins with listening. The first time Samuel heard the voice, he ran to Eli. The second time, the same, even the third. But God did not grow frustrated. He called again, patiently, lovingly, because that's what God does. He does not give up when we miss him. He calls again. And when Samuel finally understood, when he lay down again with an open heart, God spoke in full. That is still how he works. He doesn't barge in. He waits for us to respond, to become still, to say, "I'm listening now, Lord." And when we do, he begins to reveal things, not all at once, not always easily, but faithfully. What God told Samuel that night wasn't comforting. It was difficult. It was a message of judgment, but it was true. And that's what God gives first, truth. Not always what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. Because truth is what transforms. It is what sets us free. It is what restores a broken world. But truth only reaches us when we're willing to receive it. God still speaks. The world may be loud, busy, distracted, but the voice of the Lord is not lost. It's waiting in the silence, waiting in the dark moments, waiting for someone not perfect, not powerful, just willing to say, "Speak, Lord." And here's the beauty of it. When you respond, God stays. That's what he did with Samuel. The boy who listened became the man who walked with God, the man whose words never fell to the ground, the one who guided kings, led a nation, and stood between heaven and earth as a living voice of truth. All because one night, in the dark, he answered a whisper. Maybe you've been afraid of the dark places in your life. Maybe you've assumed that silence means absence. But Samuel's story reminds us of something precious. God often speaks when everything else is quiet. He doesn't need noise to be powerful. He doesn't need daylight to be near. He comes in the night. He calls in the stillness. And if you are willing, he will speak to you too. So tonight, as the world grows quiet, as the lamps burn low, as the distractions fade, perhaps it's time to whisper back the only words that truly matter. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And then wait. He will come.